Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decoding TV, a podcast about television. I'm David Chen.
I'm Christian Spicer.
Welcome to the show. On today's episode of Decoding TV, we are going to be covering the HBO original series, The Last of Us, Episode 1. You can find more episodes of this podcast at podcast.decodingtv.com. Email us at decodingtv@gmail.com and find us on TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram at Decoding TV. Now, I mentioned we're going to be covering The Last of Us Episode 1, and that is because we are recording this episode from the past. This episode of the podcast, we're actually recording it in December, and we were able to get access to the screeners early, and we're very fortunate to be able to have that access. But what that also means is that at this point, I don't know what the episode title is yet. Christian, did you see the episode title anywhere in your materials?
Pilot.
So we don't know the episode information, but also in addition to that, there may have been stuff that happens between now and when the episode is released on January 15th, marketing materials, and maybe one of the cast members gets in a bar fight. Like, we have no idea stuff that happens in January. So if we don't refer to those events, it is because we are recording this episode in December for scheduling purposes. So that's one thing I just want to start with. If it sounds like, wait a second, why there was actually a nuclear war in real life? Why did these guys talk about it? It's because we're recording it in December. Okay. The second thing I want to mention is that this podcast, Decoding TV, generally covers shows from the perspective of a show watcher. What that means is that we will not spoil anything from future week's episodes of the show. That means anything, in this case, from the video game of The Last of Us Part 1, as well as from the Next Time On preview. I will acknowledge that both Christian Spicer and I have played the Last of Us video game, and Christian Spicer is the host of the official Last of Us podcast. But we are going to work really hard to avoid spoilers for the show. So if you are just watching the show and want to get into this world through this podcast and through the show itself, then you are in safe hands. The other thing I want to mention, though, is that having watched the first episode in advance of our conversation today, Christian, The Last of Us, as we discussed in our preview episode on Decoding TV, is one of the best reviewed, best-selling video games of all time. It has a rich cinematic story. And I was really curious, like, what an HBO original series would add to this story. And having watched the first episode, they make many changes from the video game, and I think they're really interesting changes to discuss. So we will be discussing those changes, some of those changes, on this episode of the podcast, but we will also be releasing bonus episodes that will have full spoilers that you can listen to. And the first one will be available for free, but in general, you can access all bonus episodes at decodingtv.com with a paid subscription. So decodingtv.com is a paid subscription that gives you ad-free episodes, early access episodes, and bonus episodes. It's also how we fund this podcast. So consider becoming a member at decodingtv.com. You'll get some cool bonuses. Again, that's at decodingtv.com. Huge thanks to all of our members there for making this podcast possible. Okay. All that preamble aside, Christian Spicer, wow. I have been anticipating this show for many months. Finally had a chance to watch it this week. You had a chance to watch it as well. And so let's start with our overall thoughts on episode 1 of The Last of Us on HBO. What did you think of the episode?
Yeah, I mean, to say that this has been one of my most anticipated, media events would still probably be understating it. I have a Last of Us cup next to me. You mentioned doing, the official show for the game. There's an Ellie statue somewhere behind me. And the pedigree of talent associated with this show. It's not like it was announced and it was, starring your neighbor, written by that person.
It's too bad. Those are my favorite ones. Starring that person.
I mean, they haven't released anything bad yet, So the hype or the anticipation was there for me in a big way. And as we talked about on the discussion announcement of this show episode, this being an HBO show also carried, in my eyes, further weight behind it. And I was not disappointed. I mean, this felt like an HBO show. It didn't feel like an also ran, like, yeah, it's HBO, but it's a video game. It felt like it got the full weight of network resources in terms of making a beautiful cinematic small screen, because it's on a TV, even though most of us have big screens in our homes now, event. It felt like an event prestige television. And that's what made me the happiest initially. And I can get into some nits and some stuff that I thought was interesting in terms of the pilot. But before I go there, I'm curious kind of what your, first impressions, takeaways were from this pilot episode.
I really liked it. I thought it was very good, and as I mentioned, I was fascinated by some of the decisions that they made in terms of changing it from the video game, and I actually was like impressed by a lot of the changes. I was like, oh wow, like so. There's a couple of changes we'll talk about either here or in the bonus episode where I'm like, like I wonder why they changed. That doesn't seem necessary to change. And then like by the end of the episode, I'm like, oh, like that makes it so much better the way they did it. So I thought it was great. The one niggling question in the back of my head was like, uh, I wonder what a complete casual person who's never played The Last of Us, like what their experience of this show is. Unfortunately, that's generally what we try to give you on Decoding TV. I have already played the game and I loved it. Um, the one question I have is like, how different is this than The Walking Dead or any other post-apocalyptic show? And I don't know that it is that different because The Last of Us was probably largely inspired by a lot of other shows like or movies like 28 Days Later or things of that nature.
The
Um,
Road and
the
certainly
Road,
other
yeah,
media that came before it. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So, but I thought it was really well done. I was getting emotional, at certain parts that are supposed to be emotional, and um, production design wise, like it's really solid. Like it feels like they invested a lot of money into the show, and it's all on screen. Um, and the cast is overall pretty great. They made some interesting decisions casting wise, and I like all these characters. I find them all relatable. There are a couple of elements that I found to be a little video gamey, that we can get into, in not a great way. But overall, I thought it was a very strong pilot, and I really enjoyed it. I thought not only was it an enjoyable hour and 15 or hour and 20 minutes of television, but it does great honor to the video game. Personally, that's what I thought. So
Yeah.
enjoying it so far. Enjoying it so far. Yeah.
And you mentioned the oh man, my mind just went blank. That's so funny. Um, what some of the changes, and I do think many of them were smart in terms of adapting this for TV, and I look forward to that conversation. But your question too about like how is this different to the casual viewer, perhaps from other zombie or the world is now destroyed style
Right.
media. And I had that note later kind of in a discussion as the show unfolded, but I think it's an interesting topic here as well, because I think what elevated The Last of Us video game above
Mhm.
other zombie the world has ended video games, which had certainly existed pre The Last of Us as well, was its production value.
Mhm.
The way that they did mocap for the characters, and they had the actors acting in the same room together, and they brought this cinematic approach to a video game that they had done before in Uncharted, but they hadn't done no one had done a story like this before in games, and that really elevated it. And so now my question is like, yeah, how do you bring that to a show when other shows have this isn't the first high production value apocalyptic show. And so like how do you stay relevant in a world where what you've done has been done in many ways? And I think the way they approached it was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also in the video game there are several other things that made it stood apart. Like, and I guess this is a variation on what you're saying, right? But the voice acting and the writing was excellent, and also the set pieces were excellent. There's a
Mm.
lot of action set pieces in the game, and I am curious, like how action packed the TV show is going to be. So, anyway, let's get into this episode. Last of Us Episode 1 begins in 1968 with a cold open. There is a talk show interview where these doctors are talking about the possibility of a pandemic. Who'd have thought that was ever something that we might ever experience? But one of the doctors talks about his concern not for a viral pandemic like the flu, but instead he's concerned with fungus. Talks about what fungus can do. It can take over bodies, control and alter minds. Like the fungus that can take over and control an ant and slowly kill the ant from within. And he says, by the way, maybe if the planet got a couple degrees hotter, this could allow the fungus to take over everyone. And by the way, there's no cure. It's not something you can treat like with a bacterial infection or a virus. You are just SOL, completely out of luck. And then smash cut to opening credits, basically. This was interesting to me because I'm just going to be honest, like, in terms of a exposition device to like tell the audience what's going on, pretty efficient.
Yes.
But also weird and kind of played out as a concept, in my opinion. Like, there's been many post-apocalyptic movies that open with a news broadcast of some kind or a talk show of some kind. I'm just gonna throw out one example. I Am Legend, Will Smith. Like, that opened with like a news broadcast where they're talking about the stuff that actually ends up going wrong during the course of the movie. And it's like, this was just weird because this is a show invention. I don't think this was in the video game. And it's like takes place in 1968. So it's like, I don't think we're ever going to see these. Maybe we'll see these characters again. I don't know. But I just thought it was a weird way to open, given that it is kind of so different in terms of tone and visual aesthetic than like anything else we see in this episode, and I assume for much of the rest of the show. Christian, what do you think of this opening?
Yeah, I thought it was really effective, actually, and I think it serves as a bridge for Chernobyl fans. It felt very Craig Mazin in terms of that aesthetic of
Mm-hmm.
what was featured in Chernobyl, which took place, a long time ago. And so it kind of, I think, bridges that gap and lets viewers come into a world and like, oh, this is another show like that. And I think
You're saying this you're saying The Last of Us takes place in the Chernobyl universe, basically.
I mean, at this
Which
point,
by the way is our universe. I just want to point that out as well. But anyway, go ahead.
well, yeah, that's a scary universe that
Yeah.
we are always in.
Yeah.
And I also think it was very effective in doing some heavy lifting for setting up the show that wasn't required for the video game. When the first video game came out, we had not gone through COVID. And so it didn't exist in this world that we see ourselves in now. And so I think, some of the themes in this pilot episode without that setup perhaps would feel a little emptier. And I thought it was a really effective way to kind of look at the audience and say, you're living through one of these, and that's the one that this scientist isn't worried about. And here's the
Yeah.
one you should be worried about. And I think it did a really good job of putting this existential dread into
Mhm.
our real world as we watch this now fictional world, because unlike Chernobyl, this is fiction, whereas Chernobyl is this recounting of true events. So I think it was effective in making that dread in this TV show feel real.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and you're right. Like, it does delineate between like the pandemic we went through and what horrors might be in the show, and it made me want to like look it up. I'm like, I need to do some research. Like, is this actually a possible thing in real life? But I do.
Welcome to
It just
Dave's Rabbit Hole, the new
yes,
podcast on decoding.
indeed, it left me with a lot of questions. Basically, I'm like, why did they choose to reveal the information this way? I'm like, are we going to see these characters later? Like, because um they could have conveyed this information in other ways during the course of the rest of the episode. So I'm just curious, like, why they did it this way. I don't know. And maybe we'll find out, or maybe we're going to get to the end and it's like, nope, it was just this one thing. But they just have it take place. Like, here's just one sample question: why have it take place decades earlier? Like, why not have it be a recent thing? I'm just so curious, like, like all the decisions that went into it. So hopefully we'll find out later as the show goes on. But I agree it was efficient. I just thought it was a little weird. It raised a lot of questions for me that I want to have answered. So
Well,
anyway,
the last point on this, I think it does a good job of saying this isn't the video game. Just right
mm.
out of the gate, it's not the video game. You never saw this before. Here
Yeah.
we go.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we smash cut to credits, and it does use the theme song from the game, and a lot of the music seems to be either inspired by or taken directly from the game. Um, Gustavo Santolaya, who wrote some of the beautiful music for the game, like that DNA is definitely in this show, and
Academy
so
Award winner. He's
yeah,
yeah, incredible, and definitely leans on to the stuff he's created and using his actual score, but also yeah, with new elements that feel like they fit.
yeah, yeah. Agreed. And I thought the opening sort of credits were like pretty cool looking. You know, some CG fungus and stuff like that. So some good stuff. Some good stuff. Okay, so we started with 1968. The credits occur. Then it's 2003. We're in still the past, but future from where we were before.
Also decades ago.
Yeah, still
Right.
decades ago.
Less decades, but still decades ago.
What was a little weird to me was they said September 26th, 2003, and then they didn't give a date for any of the other parts of the show. Like, I think when you're in 20 years later, I don't think they give a date as to when you are there. But anyway, we meet Sarah, who is Joel's daughter, and we also meet Joel, played by Pedro Pascal. Sarah is played by Nico Parker. It's Joel's birthday, and we see that Sarah takes care of Joel. Joel takes care of Sarah. She's cooking him breakfast. We meet their brother, Joel's brother, Tommy, who's played by Gabriel Luna. And they eat breakfast together, and then Tommy and Joel head off for a construction project and promises to be home. Joel promised to be home by 9 p.m. with a cake for his birthday. And on the radio, we hear some vague references to trouble in Jakarta. They talk about like whether Jakarta is a country or not. And it honestly reminded me, Christian, of like the early days of coronavirus when you're like, oh, there's this virus in China, and you hear about it, and the news is like, oh, it's a very distant idea that, of course, would become extremely relevant very soon. So then Sarah leaves and goes to school, and we see her at school in class, and she takes a city bus to get Joel's watch fixed, but then like she gets kicked out of the watch repair shop because one of the people is, I think the watch shop owner's sister or wife is really upset about the stuff that's happening outside. We see emergency vehicles, and then Sarah is kicked out and goes home, and kind of like this is the early part where we're setting up the creeping dread and troubles that are going to come to dominate this episode and probably the rest of the show. Christian, what'd you think about these opening sequences where we're introduced to Sarah and Joel and these scenes of domesticity and kind of the encroaching danger?
So I'm curious if that date becomes relevant again. Because very often TV shows give us something, and when something is on screen for that long, my inclination is always to think what happens September 26, 2042, or whatever, right? Like why why
Yeah,
is that date on the screen in the TV show? Is it anything more than just a reference? I'm very curious if they play up to that again and how significant dates come
right.
because so
Because
far,
they don't give any other dates other than that one. So yeah,
right, and we've had a couple of years, and does any of that? This isn't a numberology show, I don't think, but I'm curious to see how that stuff plays out. Um, I really liked how quickly things the tension ratchets up, as you mentioned, like that Jakarta talking over the radio. I don't know if you did, but after I watched the pilot the first time, I went back to it and tried to really slow that down and see if
hmm
I could listen, because they start talking over it away, like you mentioned so many of us do. The morning
yeah,
show did a great job with that too, of like early coronavirus stuff and people not paying attention to it. And I thought it was fascinating how real that felt and how mundane. And then that scene at the watch shop where one, I think it's like a ambulance or a police car goes by. Then you hear more, and you hear the sounds of helicopters and stuff overhead, and it just feels like that part in the song where the orchestra is building, and there's about to be a drop. And I think it overlaid that with a lot of mundane tasks really, really well. Making breakfast, getting eggshell in the egg, not having ingredients for this, still going to work. I think it really played those two different feelings really well.
yeah, and I hate to keep comparing this to real life experiences, but we all just went through a pandemic together, you know, like so I feel the need to relate it to my actual experiences. But it reminded me of in the early days of the pandemic, people had differing levels of opinions on how dangerous things were. So I remember uh, my wife needed to go get her car fixed at the dealership, and I was like, "Oh, I'll go take it in. I'll go take it in." She's like, "No, don't go to the dealership." I'm like, "Really? Like, is that really going to be a thing?" We had no idea it was airborne at the time. We had no idea like how it spread, and I was like, "Really? What's the big deal?" And it reminded me of like that scene in the watch shop when that woman is like, "You got a GTFO, Sarah. Like, you need to get out of here." And the guy's like, "What's the big deal? What's going?" Like um, that in the early stages, it's like chaos, and as we have unfortunately learned in real life, in the late stages, it can be chaos as well in terms of people disagreeing about how safe things are. So I like that kind of that chaotic sense that's captured in the early scenes. Um, okay, so Sarah goes home and she meets with a neighbor named Connie. And I
She's an
think it's like
older woman,
older
not
woman,
quite
yeah,
grandparent age, but older than her dad.
yeah,
Yeah, like a next door neighbor that she's kind with, right?
right, right. Except for the fact that Connie likes raisin cookies, not chocolate chip. Really, just really nice touch. And like, there's an amazing scene where so I couldn't figure out, was Connie the younger woman that was there, or was she the old infirm woman in the chair?
Connie
Um,
is the younger woman, like
yeah,
again, probably in her 60s, and then
yeah.
her mother is kind of in a vegetative state there in a wheelchair. And Connie, very much doesn't seem concerned, right? Sarah has a little bit of concern from seeing the emergency vehicles and seeing that happen to her at the watch shop. And I love Connie's line of like, 3 nails plus one cross equals forgiven. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm praying. Let's go make
Yep,
some raisin cookies.
yep,
God
yep.
bless. And it felt
Mm-hmm.
so just dismissive in a way that makes you want to roll your eyes, but also Sarah couldn't like fight and yell and because she didn't know what was going on. And so here you have this parental or older than parental neighbor being like, "Oh, it's fine, hun. Let's go."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's hard to reckon with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's an amazing scene, in my opinion, where like you see Connie's mom in the background out of focus and she starts like changing. She starts like transforming, like something's wrong with her. There's a really creepy scene where like the dog looks at her. This is all just like really, in my opinion, well executed horror genre material. Like it's something's not quite right, and the way they're revealing it is very vague and very mysterious, but in my opinion, very effective. So I loved all that stuff. Like it's really, you're scared. You're scared, right?
And we hadn't seen that older woman move in any way, shape, or form. There's the earlier
Yeah.
scene where Connie's husband is feeding her a biscuit, and she can't open her mouth. And Connie even says, like, I don't know why I talked to her. She's deaf. She doesn't, she's, and then you see her again blurred behind Sarah kind of moving. And it's unsettling in all the right ways.
Can I go off on a wild side tangent rant here for a moment, Christian? This is I'll keep it short. I'll keep it short. But I do feel like old people are like one of the last groups that it's okay to depict in like a horrifying fashion, you know, uh, in TV and movies. Like, I think I became acutely aware of this when I watched like The Visit, the M Night Shyamalan movie. Who, by the way, has dealt with old people in several of his recent films, including Old. Um, and just like there's a lot of horror films and other things that depict old people in like a scary way, and I'm just sensitive to it, because we're all going to be old one day, and the way they depict this older couple next door is like not very flattering, even before she transforms into a zombie. So anyway, just a side rant. I hope we have more positive depictions of older people in general
I,
in
I
our
think
in our media.
like shorthand for, we associate usually older people with being kind and gentle or not a threat, right? Because of they're
Mhm.
frail. And so I think it's just easy shorthand juxtaposition for, you thought it was this, but it's this. It's like a bunny
Yeah,
rabbit that becomes a demon or something. It's
but
just
there's, like, a
supposed
scene
to.
where, like, they wanna give him the biscuit and, like, her mouth is full of, like, biscuit chunks, and
Yeah.
she's made to look disgusting, and it's like, I don't know if that's really necessary. I understand the storytelling purpose is like, oh, she could barely even eat biscuits, now she's, like, murdering dudes, like,
Right.
look at
Yeah.
how horrifying it is. But it's just like, it's just a mini rant that many people, as with many of my rants on Decoding TV, people might find nonsensical, and, um, write into how much you disagree with me at decodingtv@gmail.com. Okay. So Sarah goes home and Joel comes home, and they're about to settle in and have a nice father daughter bonding time. She gives him the watch that she has repaired. And it seems to be very meaningful to him because he wouldn't have gone to repair it himself because he's a busy dude. And then Sarah also gives him a DVD that she got, which I believe is called uh, Curtis and the Viper 2. This is a fictional action movie that is from the world of the game, I believe. So you cannot go and buy Curtis and the Viper 2. I've already tried. But anyway, she falls asleep while they're watching it together, and then Joel gets a call from Tommy that he got into a barroom brawl and he needs to go bail him out of jail. So uh, he kind of takes her to her bed, and then she falls asleep, and then she wakes up to the sound of helicopter noises, and that's when stuff really starts to hit the fan. This whole section, when she's coming out of her house, she goes next door, she discovers the body. Joel comes home and all this stuff. I thought it was all very like the helicopter noise, the sound design of the helicopters. I thought this was all really just well done. Any thoughts on this section when she's kind of realizing what's going on?
Yeah, I thought it was effective in giving her a reason to go over and a reason to come outside, right? There's always the thing in the horror movie of like, run! There's that Geico commercial that those actors have probably bought 10 homes on that gets shown every Halloween of them making stupid decisions in a horror movie. Like, let's get in the running car. No, go hide behind the chainsaws. Yay! Every year, those actors they're feasting
Mm-hmm.
on those
Mm-hmm.
royalties. And I think they do a good job here in The Last of Us of giving Sarah a reason to come outside and to investigate with the neighbor's dog. And, she's a good person. She has a relationship with this family. She's going to bring the dog home, see what's going on. And then
Yeah.
everything kind of builds on top of that to create a really unnerving situation, but one that I could find myself in. And so often in horror movies, I think you talked about it on White Lotus, where it's like, I would have left the hotel by
Yeah.
now. Not
Yeah.
horror, but like, I would not do what that character does. But here I could see myself very easily doing what Sarah did, like maybe bringing a baseball bat with me, like that would help,
Hundred
But it
hundred
was a
percent, 100%. And the reveal of Connie's mom, like with the kind of fungus growing out of her mouth, is like really scary, and they linger on it in an appropriate way. And then Joel comes, to the rescue, driving his pickup truck, and just knocks that person the f out. It is really effective. One of the most effective things about this whole sequence too is like how much stuff is not in focus. How
Mhm.
much stuff is in the background, barely out of focus. You see them driving away, and one of the neighbors is like, Joel, what are you doing? And then, tries to help
Get
Connie's mom, and
inside,
then like,
get inside.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then like she gets overtaken, but you like don't even like that story is not even one you're going to be exposed to on the show, as far as we know. Um, I will say that I think a lot of these shots are like lifted directly from the video game, if I recall correctly. So it's not like the show conceived of them, but they executed them quite well, I thought. So, yeah. Any thoughts on kind of this? Any other thoughts on the opening parts of this realization that something is horribly wrong with society?
I mean, I think they did a great job setting themselves apart from the game. One in the spending the time with Sarah at the watch shop and the neighbor, and then the game we have the moment of just the neighbor at the door. And this feels much more believable in a way that I think really works for, again, passive media. And having Joel and Tommy come in at just the right time, it
Hmm.
feels, a little coincidence can get you into a scene, but it's not supposed to ever get you out of a scene. But it feels believable in terms of them returning at the time in which they did, and them also being armed with additional information that Sarah does not have because they were just in county lockup. And Tommy talks about he already had an experience with a hyper aggressive person at a bar, and then imagine what the prison was like. And as this thing is spreading, so I really like how it doesn't feel like the I don't know what's happening, but trust me when I say this. It's like, no, 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 Sarah. They have a little bit more information than you. Listen to them and get the heck out of here.
Indeed, indeed. All right. Well, it was really wild to see Joel come in on that truck of his, and it does turn out to be really reliable. But I suspect that he might have had a better time using one of the vehicles from our sponsor, Nissan. This episode of Decoding TV is brought to you by Nissan. As a pioneer in the electric vehicle space, Nissan is always looking for ways to deliver new, meaningful technologies to EV owners. After all, Nissan's been making EVs since 1947, and their EVs have now traveled 8 billion miles by Nissan Leaf owners since 2010. 8 billion miles. That's the equivalent of driving to the Pluto and back, which, by the way, is something that you probably want to do if you were involved in the events of what happened in the first episode of The Last of Us. Um, get out of here. Get out of this planet. Do you think that's electrifying? One of their EVs trekked all the way to the North Pole, and Nissan even tests their EV technology on the Formula E racetrack. But Nissan knows that you don't get an EV for just the E. You get a Nissan EV because it makes you feel electric, because it sparks your imagination. It ignites something within you. It pins you to your seat, and it takes your breath away. At least that's what Nissan thinks about when designing their EVs, like the Nissan Ariya and the Nissan Leaf. It's about creating a thrilling design that electrifies its customers. I love Nissan's focus on creating a thrilling drive and an electrifying life. In today's world, it's so important to look around you, to pay attention, to look for all the tiny ways that life can electrify you. Like in the case of the characters of The Last of Us, where I'm just going to say an impending zombie apocalypse is really going to electrify them and get them to leave town as quickly as possible. So if you're looking for the kind of electricity that is your get up and go, consider Nissan EVs that electrify. All right, Christian, let's talk about what happens in the rest of this scene. I really liked the way a lot of this scene was shot. Um,
In the truck.
because in the truck, because a lot of it is in one like long continuous shots. Um, and this sequence, but also the whole show and the game itself and so on, like they're all very reminiscent of Children of Men, in my opinion, right? In another movie, by the way, in which they're traveling across the country to bring someone who is valuable in some way, uh, where there are long continuous shots inside of vehicles. So, but I thought they were very well done here, and you really get a sense of like how scary and frightening and unpredictable it is, and like anything could happen. So yeah, I thought all the truck stuff going into town and stuff was great. There's also a very brief scene where there's a family on the side of the road that they like consider whether or not to pick up, and Joel's like, no, someone else is going to get them. And you kind of get some insight into how protective Joel is of his family in that moment. But yeah, any other thoughts on this whole like action sequence? Like, there's a lot of stuff going on: the plane crashing, going into town, people running after them, and then obviously the inevitable conclusion that we'll discuss. But any other thoughts on this whole sequence?
What I like about this sequence a lot is how it shows how fast this thing seems to perhaps be spreading around the world. I believe it was 3 or 4 planes that you see in distress, maybe 2, certainly more than 1, that are I'm led to believe have been overrun by grandmas, whatever this thing is, right? These enraged, zombified
Mhm.
people, and these are big planes. These are big commercial planes just coming down over Austin instead of going at the airport, and they're in distress and all wobbly. And I think that shows with the Jakar story earlier, and then the watchmaker's partner or sister talking about things happening with her family across the world. I think it does a really good job of environmental storytelling, so to speak, of showing how big this problem is in a way of showing, not telling. We don't cut back to the scientist. It's like, yes, I told you it would, it's like you see the world collapsing. And I think that's super effective. And I also
Mhm.
love the in the car moment. It reminded me of, scenes in the Batman and that car chase of how what it
Yeah.
must feel like to be in a car in that situation
Yeah.
versus watching it from afar. And I think they did a really good job of making us feel like we're in that situation where something horrible happens and it zooms past you. What was, oh my God.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I
Like
think that's really effective.
you're barely seeing what's actually happening because you just turned around at the right moment, or you might have just missed it. The plane stuff was wild, man. Like, because there's like a shot where like three huge jetliners like fly past a truck and
Yeah.
like really low to the ground, and it's like, whoa, I've never seen anything like that before. You're not used to seeing that stuff. And
And it
so
looks
it's
great
yeah,
too.
it,
Like
it
I
looks good. It
imagine
looks good. Yeah.
they were not dropping planes out of the sky IRL. So the
Well,
effects they have here
there's this
looks
amazing
really good.
scene when like the plane crashes and it explodes, right? And I agree with you, they didn't drop a plane IRL, but the lighting looks really good. It looks like they actually blew something up.
Yeah.
And yeah, it looks spectacular. The whole sequence looks spectacular in my opinion. So really unfolding chaos that's like just really terrifying. And then there's a chase sequence where Joel Sarah is like injured because I think a part of the plane hits the vehicle, right?
Yeah, the vehicle's
And
overturned, her foot's kinda stuck in it, and he
yeah,
has to,
so
like,
she can't
drag
run
her out.
anymore. She can't run anymore. Joel grabs her and starts running with her, and then one of the zombie-like creatures, um, and I think later, uh, there's a sign that indicates what these things are called, right? Like, um, but it's never spoken, right? But like, I think it's cordyceps is what they're called. We see a sign later on the wall that we'll talk about, but um, I think they're called cordyceps, the things that are humans that are taken over by this fungus. And we see one of them pursue Joel, and we see this thing can freaking move, man. Like it's not just running; it's like pouncing. It's using all fours. Like whatever this fungus is doing, it's controlling humans in such a way that they have almost superhuman like abilities.
They're from the
And
Snyderverse of zombie
mhm,
movies. They
mhm, the Snyder Dawn of the Dead, right?
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
thought the chase sequence was awesome when this thing and what one advantage they don't have is like they're not very precise. This thing's like crashing through things. It's not like super precise in its movements, but it does have brute force at its disposal. So anyway, they seem to be saved by a military personnel wearing like hazmat equipment. But then the military personnel appears to get orders to exterminate Joel and his daughter Sarah, and they're about to do that. They get some shots off, I believe, when Tommy shows up, saves them at the last minute, kills the military guy. But unfortunately, Sarah is killed in all the ensuing gunfire that occurs. This is a heartbreaking scene. Having played the game, I knew it was coming, but I still like kind of cried a little bit during the scene because the performance by Pedro Pascal is so raw here. I thought it was really effective, and also what's really effective is the first half of this episode really makes it seem like Sarah's going to be the protagonist of the show, right? Like a lot of the opening scenes are told from her perspective. You go to school with her. You like she's getting dressed in the morning, getting ready in the morning, buying Joel her gift, like etc. You think Sarah's going to be the protagonist, and then she's unceremoniously killed halfway through the episode. It's really effective storytelling. Obviously, it's from the game, but it's really well done here. Christian, what do you think of this very, very critical scene?
Yeah, I mean, the moment where Joel is there holding her and, I have 2 daughters, myself,
Hmm.
and, talking about this scene and watching it wrecks me every time, and when he's holding her there and just says, "I know, I know, I know, I know, I know, I know, I know," and it's like the helplessness in his voice alongside the realization of what's happening. Um, I don't wanna say it wouldn't connect if you're not a father, but it's hard. It's hard. It's hard to watch, and it's not rushed. They stay on it.
Yeah.
And it's not gratuitous violence, it's not like a Sarah has, like, a gaping hole, and that's what they're
Mhm.
That's the trauma they're trying to show you.
Yeah.
It's the trauma of the human, and I think Tommy is so beautifully played here too, in terms of recognizing Sarah's injury first and trying to be there for his brother. It is a beautiful scene in the midst of all this chaos that, you can't imagine how someone comes back from that without being destroyed as a human being. Like, that is a flashpoint in someone's life that will
Yeah.
make them never the same, regardless of everything else that's just happened the prior, 30 minutes of their day.
Mhm. Mhm. One of the moments that I thought was most poignant was like when Joel, I think at one point he asks Tommy for help, or he's trying to motion to Tommy, and Tommy like looks at him and he's just like, Joel, like he knows it's over. Like he knows she's not going to survive this. And that is a heartbreaking moment too, of like just his realization of what's going on, and how he kind of gets there, not necessarily before, but like in a different way than Joel. It's a brutal, brutal scene. And it's really well done. Really well done. So,
And for me, I could have seen credits there.
mhm.
Like, it
You
wouldn't
wanted
have.
the episode to end right there.
I mean, it hit heavy, right? I was like, time to go to the bathroom.
And you said this before we started recording too, about how like this felt like two episodes sewn together, and I do agree with you to some degree, but I think that they needed to do it this way to tell you what the show is going to be.
Mm,
Like, if they had only aired the first half of this episode and it ends with her dying, like you don't know what the show's going to be. I get to the end of this episode, I have a sense of what the show's going to be, and that show matches the show that they're marketing,
mm,
and so
I
on.
see. That's interesting.
So yeah. So, but I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint, that it feels a little bit unwieldy with these two halves, because we are introduced to a whole bunch of new characters in the
And
second half of the episode. You know.
I'm guarded now. I'm
Hmm.
I'm Game of Thrones guarded. Fool me once, all that
Hmm.
stuff. Like, every character I meet, like, I binged Game of Thrones, and I feel like I came into that show late, so no broad spoilers for it, but I feel like I started to see the themes of, like, I've watched too much too fast, and now with how this sets up characters, it's like, well, I'm not going to care about that character because they already did me dirty in the first 30
That's
minutes.
interesting. I have the total opposite. I mean, I agree with you that killing off Sarah means like no one is safe. But I am very energized by that, because sometimes you have the opposite problem. I'm just gonna throw this out there, Christian. Uh, did you watch the Rings of Power, Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power?
Some, not all.
Well, there might be something that happens in that show that, at first blush, seems like a mass casualty event in
Mm,
which no one dies, and then you're like, well, what is the point of any of this?
yeah.
Or very few people die. Let me put it that way. Like, so I like that the show like establishes stakes right up front. Like, hey, don't, like, any of these characters could die. Like, this show is willing to go anywhere, and I like that. So, again, of course, this is all stuff that happens in the video game as well, but um, it's worth noting because the show is a different thing, and and the show can and will and already has made different creative decisions than the game. So, anyway, we flash forward to 20 years later. 20 years later. They are in Boston now. It's 2023, and we see a child stumbling through the forest in the outskirts of Boston. Uh, People in the early days of the pandemic, when they saw deer in the road, and other creatures inhabiting, cities, were like, nature is healing. Well, this is kind of, nature has healed. I wanted to make a joke when I saw Boston. I was like, hey, that's what Boston looks like today. Um, because I'm from Boston. But yeah, it seems like the outbreak or whatever has really done a number on major cities such as Boston. So this child goes over to this place that is labeled quarantine zone, and they bring this child inside and they tie them to a wheelchair. Now, you thought it was a boy, right? I couldn't actually tell whether it was a boy or a girl. I don't remember if they speak or not.
I did assume, based on how they looked to me, that it was a young male child. But yeah, I don't think they ever confirm, one way or the other.
Yeah. So they are strapped down to a wheelchair, and it's like, hey, we're just keeping you safe. And I believe the organization that is running this whole place is called Fedra, right? It's a fictional organization, called which is stands for the Federal Disaster Response Agency. So that's what Fedra is. And we see some signs on the wall that are very helpful. They say signs of cordyceps infection are coughing, slurred speech, muscle spasms, and mood change. Like, so if you get infected and you show those signs, you might have the cordyceps infection. And also, you will become fully infected at different rates depending on where the infection came from. So if it was on the neck, face, or head, it's 5 to 15 minutes. Torso, arms, shoulder, or hand, 2 to 8 hours. And leg or foot, 12 to 24 hours. So you basically, the lower down in your body you get bitten or whatever happens, the slower it is. And you want to get bitten on the ankle because then you have like 24 hours to say goodbye to your loved ones, basically. There's a great scene where this woman talks to the child, and the guards put a little machine to her, to their neck, and the machine has a red light, kind of indicating that this person has been infected. And she tells the child that they'll be okay, and they give them a shot. But what they're actually doing, I think, is either sedating them or euthanizing them at that point. It's a really effective scene, I thought. What did you think, Christian?
Yeah, I think it does a good job of showing one again. I think quickly showing how far the world has fallen in arguably a short amount of time. 20 years, not that long to have the world look vastly different than it did, where you would assume that large sections of the city are uninhabited for it to be as nature healed, as
Hmm.
as it is. And I also think it shows both the humanity but also the brutality of the world. Where here this woman Fedra agent isn't cold and callous, and it clearly is still affecting her. And you have to imagine that she's done this several times. There are tears in her eyes, or welling up in her eyes, I should say. But also, she's not gonna not do it. They see a little scratch on the child's knee, and then the red light scan, and they know what has to be done. And this is now the world they live in. And also, you see, the technology looks kind of Star Wars Episode 4, 5, 6. It's like banged up, lived in. They're not in a shiny
Hmm.
chrome,
Yeah,
Hunger
they're not
Games
shiny and
style
chrome. Yeah.
room. Yeah, and I
Um,
think it's effective in a lot of those ways.
that's such a fascinating interpretation of the Fedra agent's reaction. I didn't read that at all. Maybe I wasn't watching closely enough. I didn't see the tears. I thought it was kind of like a very efficient, you
Mm.
know, not not a coldness, not necessarily. I didn't sense compassion there. Let me put that way. I sense like, oh, this is, here's another thing we got to do. Like that's kind of what I sensed. But I think the performance is open to interpretation. Maybe I read it wrong, or maybe I didn't watch closely enough in that scene. But
I think the
interesting.
the words she says too, like we're gonna get you fed, we're gonna get you all the toys. Like they have this child strapped down. They don't need to talk to it. It's not gonna go anywhere. They could have just,
Hmm.
one and done it.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
And I think she was trying to put it at ease, maybe so there wouldn't be a struggle.
Yeah,
But
I didn't think it was cruel in any way. I didn't think she was cruel in any way. But I think you're right that like there is a kind of full spectrum of Fedra agents in this episode that we see.
yes,
Between this woman, between the people like hanging the people for leaving the quarantine zone, and between the one that Joel is interacting with to trade. I think they're called cards, is what the currency is in the future. Um, yeah, uh, nice spectrum of who Fedra agents can really be. So we are then go inside the Boston city limits, and they're burning bodies. And this woman sees this child as a body that needs to be burned, and she's like, "I can't do it." So she asks, "Mystery dude, it's Joel," and he kind of just dispassionately throws his body into the fire, and it's like That's how you know Joel DGAF anymore. You know, he's the death of Sarah has inexorably changed him into a guy who's okay burning children's bodies. Um, kind of gets in line, and it's clear that he's like looking for more work. He's willing to do dirty work. He's trying to kind of make as much money as he can. Um, we see various things about what it's like to live in the QZ. Curfew hours from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. People are being hanged, and Joel is dealing drugs to this Fedra guard off to the side in this alley. So, yeah, any thoughts on kind of the establishment of Boston as this place in the early parts of the second half of this episode?
This is the only part that, not the only part, but the first time that kind of left me wanting a little bit, and I think it was for efficacy of storytelling. They didn't, but I am curious what what does is there any infrastructure to the city other than Fedra or scraping by? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is there just what's the John Q. Public, or Joe the plumber from whatever election cycle that was? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's average Joe or average Sue doing? And I get the idea that the show is presenting there's criminals and people hustling to get by, people just suffering, and then Fedra. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that is all there is, but it's like really, really oppressive, the world they
Mm-hmm.
paint that people live in 2023 Boston. It
Yeah.
kind of shocked me at how oppressive it is. Like, there's
Mm.
no hope in those city walls, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what your criticism is like it doesn't necessarily feel like a fully fleshed out place. It feels like um, perhaps like broad ideas of what a place might be.
Yeah, of
Um,
like what a post-apocalyptic, living situation could be, but it doesn't feel new, right? It doesn't feel like, it's not The Walking Dead where they just found the school and they live there now. It's like, this is established, and I guess this is people's routine. Um, but it does feel like it's more to represent the idea of what that would be versus what it might actually be.
mhm. We learn of a group called the Fireflies, which, according to Fedra, is kind of a terrorist organization. Later on, through some fairly clunky exposition, we learn that what they are trying to do, the Fireflies, is they are in, quote, a war against a military dictatorship to restore freedom and democracy, end quote. But it's clear that Fireflies have been blowing things up and basically making things hard for Fedra agents. And the guard that Joel's speaking with says, "Hey, stay off the streets because you don't know. People have itchy trigger fingers. You don't want to get caught up in the shuffle." So at that point, we meet Tess. Uh, Tess is hanging out with someone named Robert, and we learn that Robert has uh, has sold a truck battery to Tess, did not deliver the battery, sold the battery to someone else, and then spent the money that Tess gave him. So he seems like a big asshole. And not
He's just
only
getting
that,
by. He's getting by in the QZ, Dave. He's just
hmm
getting by.
and he does not want to let Tess go because it's like, if you tell Joel that I did this to you, Joel's going to kick my ass. And Tess is like, I'm going to tell him nothing about this. Just please let me out of here. Before he can actually agree to do that, a car bomb explodes a Fedra vehicle, and then it's followed by like what appears to be a Firefly sniper attack against Fedra agents. Tess somehow makes it out of there, but actually she somehow survives, but is taken into a Fedra lockup. We later learn. I don't think we ever see her in Fedra lockup, if I recall correctly, but
We see her
um,
get taken into custody and
yeah,
then come out later,
yeah.
like some time later, 12 hours later or whatever.
We then meet a girl named Veronica who's chained to a radiator, and she's being tested to see if she still has her wits about her. Like being told to do tasks like count 1 through 10. Um, this person is played by Bella Ramsey. We later learned that her actual name is Ellie, so I'll call her Ellie from now on. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about her later. What else happens this episode? Joel goes to a radio operator, and there's this cool scene where like there's this whole line of people that are like trying to communicate via radio, and he goes in and gives cigarettes to the radio operator, which is something that the Fedra agent or Fedra guard gave to him. And it becomes clear that he's very upset because he hasn't heard from Tommy in 3 weeks when he usually hears from Tommy overnight. So Tommy's still alive, at this period of time, and Joel's looking for him and he cares about him.
Well,
Um,
I don't know if Tommy's still alive.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think that's
It's,
the gist. Is Tommy was alive 3 weeks ago?
yeah, that's what I meant to say. Is like he had survived the last 20 years. Is what I was trying to say.
Yes. Oh, yes,
Um,
yes, yes.
and so Joel's trying to find him, but yes, Tommy may not, in fact, have survived through the events of the last few weeks because apparently it's pretty dangerous out there, and we do learn that in real time during the course of this episode. So, I just really love this idea. You're talking about how like uh, some of the stuff doesn't feel super well established in the world, and this is a thing that like, oh, that does make sense that people would
Yes.
communicate via radio. There'd be no more infrastructure anymore. One of the things I really liked was Joel gives the Fedra guard this bag of drugs, and he's like, "I need that bag back." And
Yeah, yes.
it's like, oh yeah, because you can't just go to the store and buy a Ziploc bag probably in this time of in this time in the future. So I do like there's a lot of these little touches of like what would life in the post-apocalyptic future actually be like. Those are all pretty effective. So anyway, feel free to cut in if there's anything else you want to talk about here. But Joel goes home and he
Well, I
planned.
guess
Yeah.
my
Oh,
only
go
note
ahead.
here, and we'll get to Ellie later, and maybe this is for the, I don't know if you know this guy's name's Jeff Kanata.
Never
Maybe
heard
the
of him.
Veronica, maybe Veronica would be effective for Jeff Kanata's or a total casual viewer of the show. But that was a moment that felt odd to me, as Bella has been so advertised as Ellie
Mm.
that I was like, why they called her
Yeah,
Veronica?
what
Okay,
was the point? Like, what was the point of it? But it's just to show. I think it's to show you that they took great lengths to disguise
hide
her
who she,
identity. To disguise
yeah.
her identity, um, for reasons that are not yet clear to us. Really, like we get some hint of like what their background is, but um, like why would Marlene want to hide Veronica slash Ellie? Um, we there's still parts of the story we don't yet know from the show. So anyway, so Joel goes home. We see that his watch is broken. It's probably broken some point in the last 20 years, but he still wears it. And then Tess comes home. And then they like wake up the next morning together and they talk about all the stuff that went down over the course of the last day, which is very eventful. Um, so Tess wants to go and beat Robert up and get the battery and or get their money or whatever. And Joel wants to go find Tommy. Like that's his mission. So they set off to try to find Robert to beat him up and hopefully get this battery that he took and or that he still has and uh, and use it to set out west. That plot line eventually intersects with the Fireflies and Marlene. So we meet the character of Marlene, who is played by Merle Dandridge, and we learn that she is the head of the Boston chapter of the Fireflies. Or she is called like kind of the Che Guevara of Boston. And you kind of get a sense that they're like revolutionaries raging against the Fedra machine. Um, I thought all the casting in the episode was really strong, Christian. Like, what did you think of Durrell as I'm sorry, Merle as Marlene, but also like all the other performances that we've been introduced to in the second half of this episode?
Yeah, I agree. I think the casting is really strong, and it's also, perhaps we'll talk about this more later as in terms of more differences from the game, but it's a much more diverse cast than the
Yeah,
game.
yeah,
And I think in kind of like my little critique earlier of the world not feeling as real, I think this casting feels more real. This feels like a lived in world where there are people of different body types, colors, gender, and you see it's not just a bunch of white dudes everywhere, everywhere you look. Even between the Fedra guards, you see different sizes,
yeah,
shapes, color people. I think it's really effective. And I think the same is true of the Fireflies when we meet them. I think, what we meet five or so there at the beginning, and they all look kind of like revolutionaries in terms of dress and stuff like that, and they're
yeah,
dirty and a little beat up, but it's not video game character white dude NPC, that you so often see in games to fill a room. It looks like real people coming together to do a thing. And everybody, I think, nailed their role really, really well. And I think we've talked about Sarah's story already, but I think especially Sarah was so well played. And then now meeting Marlene, she has this hint of humanity behind her, which I find fascinating. You know,
Mhm.
kindness in her eyes, but also clearly tough as nails when she needs to be. And I think an actor bringing both of those things to a role isn't always the easiest thing to do. And I think the way the character of Marlene carries those burdens in this pilot episode is really phenomenal.
Yeah. It's worth noting that in the video game, Joel, Ellie, and Sarah are all white characters, right?
And
Whereas,
Tommy,
and Tommy. Whereas here, obviously, Pedro Pascal is Chilean American, and Sarah, I think, was black, and also, Bella Ramsey is white. But it's a much more diverse group of people overall in the show. So yeah, I'm loving the cast so far. Christian, you know what a really efficient way of filming an action scene is? You film it after it's over. You film everything that's happened after the action has already occurred. So, uh,
Daredevil gave us the hallway scene, and The Last
mhm,
of Us gives us the post hallway
the
scene.
post hallway scene, right? So, I mean, we should point out that there is a conversation that Ellie and Marlene have, right? Where like there's a few things revealed in the Ellie Marlene dialogue. First of all, I think there's a character referred to called Riley, like which seems to resonate with Ellie for reasons we may find out later in the season. But he's like,
it,
you
it,
know, yeah,
it feels like someone saying to Joel, Sarah. You know, like it feels like someone's touching a
mhm,
wound
yeah,
when this is referenced. And it's also Marlene's coming out, not in terms of sexuality, but Marlene's reveal to Ellie, which I thought
mhm,
find interesting, where like Ellie has been in Marlene's life for years, but Ellie hasn't known about Marlene until
yeah,
now. And I think that dynamic is fascinating also. Like, I'm your guardian angel. Well, jerk, where were you the last 20 years of my life?
right,
You know,
right.
like, why now? Why today?
I think it's fair to say, and we learn at the end of the episode, right, that Ellie has bite marks, but she is not does not appear to be infected, and that this may be a reason why she is important, right? So that's why Marlene wants to take a bunch of the Fireflies and travel west with her because, like, presumably that's like part of why Ellie's important. But Marlene kind of communicates to Ellie, "Hey, like, you're really important. You are the key to potentially all this. Like, we need to take you west." Strong children of men vibes, in my opinion. But anyway, uh, before they can set off on their amazing plan, like all the Fireflies meeting together and go out there, this deal with Robert and the battery goes real south. Huge firefight. Lots of people die. Massive gunfight. Like, it seems like I don't know. At least half a dozen people were killed. So it had to be like a massive action scene that we barely missed. And that's when Joel and Tess show up, and Marlene recruits them to take Ellie out west to like a Firefly station. Now, I actually thought that this was like fairly plausible. Like, because the question you're going to ask as a person watching this is like, why would Marlene trust these randos with this like extremely important mission? And it's because A, she knows that they're capable, which is something she indicates. B, she doesn't really have that many options, and C, their interests are temporarily aligned, right? So I thought this was like a pretty neat sort of storytelling that it all kind of made sense to me. Like, I don't think it quite plays out exactly this way in the video game, Christian. But what did you think of how these characters all intersecting and meeting, and kind of Joel and Tess and Ellie kind of setting out on their own at this point?
I really liked how this scene kind of balanced this idea of, being brought into the world as a viewer, but also you're being brought into a world that already exists. The way Marlene and Joel interact with each other, they clearly have a prior relationship.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
again, there's not a 15-minute exposition of like, remember in 2014 when we were stationed in, it's just the way that Marlene acts around her. Joel and is aware of Tess, but doesn't have the same relationship with Tess that she had with Joel. And so you get a lot done without a lot being said in how these characters play this scene in the hallway. And I think it's really efficient for setting up what's going to happen next. And I think they did a good job setting up why it's so important for Joel to go west as well to find Tommy, his brother. Here's a man that we've seen in his life has a few people in his family. There was no partner. There was no Sarah's mom, and it was Sarah, Tommy, Joel. Sarah's gone. 20 years later, Tommy might be gone too. You have the impression that Joel's going to do what he has to to save him. And then you get this line of Joel to Marlene of "You took my brother away from me" or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing. Like, you corrupted him. You turned him against me. Oh man. I mean, I feel like I'm sitting down to eat there. Like, that is fascinating. The
Mhm, mhm.
the blame that he's putting on this woman for this thing he has to go do, but now he's still going to help her because he knows, as you mentioned, their interests are aligned in this moment. um oh, Joel in this moment is fascinating to me. Like, is he a protector, or is he just does not care? He's going to do what he needs to
Like a
get his.
mercenary, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that in general, the storytelling, both of the video game and of the show, is like really subtle. So there is that one scene where Marlene says, "We are in a war against a military dictatorship to restore freedom and democracy." End quote. That I was like, "Ooh, that's pretty clunky dialogue." But the rest of the show's dialogue is like overall pretty subtle, pretty solid, pretty plausible in my opinion. So anyway, so they agree. Joel gives Ellie back the knife. There's a lot of focus on knives this episode, right? Sarah kind of picks up Joel's knife early on in the episode. Ellie really wants her knife, so I'm kind of curious, like if knives are going to play a bigger role in the show. But they go
I mean,
back
a
to
glass onion comes in at the very end of the
Mhm.
episode, and you realize
Mm,
it's been a Knives Out story the whole time. Yeah,
indeed. They go back to the apartment, and Joel and Tess like lock Ellie inside the apartment while they debate what the plan's going to be. While she's in there, Ellie looks at this radio and this book and realizes there's a code. She figures it out, that the radio is there's like a book of the Billboard 100. So I guess the idea is like you look up the song that plays in the book, and then you can figure out which decade it's from. And she says, quote, 60 songs, they don't have anything new. It's a smuggling code. 60 songs, they don't have anything new. 70 songs, they got new stuff. What's 80s? And then Joel doesn't explain what 80s is, but later she figures out it means basically there's trouble. People are in trouble, right? I thought that was clever. Really, really cool little touch there. And I should point out that the episode ends with, I think it's an 80s song by Depeche Mode called Never Let Me Down Again. So
and I love that. I love the idea of 80s music being scary. Like,
well,
they're
we all know
scary.
that the 80s, foretold the ending of humanity, like in
But
many ways.
with joyous music, though.
Mhm, mhm.
Neon bright color. You picture the 80s, and it's like, jazzercise or whatever, like the late 80s, early 90s. And I love the idea, even Depeche Mode coming on at the end. It's like, uh, oh yeah, I love it. I love all that. Like, it's not,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's a cool idea of like you broadcast a song because like no one will be able to tell, as opposed to you radioing and bring the bombs to the the outpost, please.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't. It's a cool idea. Like it's a cool code that's like not easily decipherable. I like that idea. So anyway, they begin to attempt to sneak out of the city. Joel, Ellie, and Tess. And actually, there is this moment that Joel and Ellie have where they kind of like talk a little bit, and you learn like what kind of life you learn a little bit about what kind of life Ellie's had, which is like a very small life. Like she hasn't really been outside very much, and she's kind of been had her life dictated to her for most of her existence. We learn a little bit about her background, that she went to like a Fedra training camp, right? Like from Marlene. So it's cool, these nice little touches where we're learning a little bit more about Ellie during the course of the episode. I do think that most of Ellie's performance here is kind of like very belligerent, very kind of snarky, belligerent character. Um, and it does feel a little bit out of pace with the rest of the tone of the show so far, in my opinion. Um, I know, like my guess is there is like a more serious side to Ellie that we're gonna find out, but like for most of this episode, she's kind of like cracking wise and almost an audience surrogate in some ways. And it did feel a little bit discordant to me. I don't know if you had that feeling, Christian.
Yeah, that didn't jump out at me. I mean, as you
Okay.
say it, I can see hear her lines in my head and see those scenes in the show. But I also feel like I don't know if you have a teen or preteen. I mean, I do know, but I'll say, I don't know, dear listener, if you, I'll break it
Mhm.
broader, have a teen or preteen at home.
Mhm.
But, you know, snark is like the Colorado River 20 years ago. It flows freely, my friends, at that age.
Mhm. Mhm. So
Not like
you
the
thought
Colorado River
is very
today.
true to life, very accurate. Yeah.
She's been in a bad situation with no agency, right? She's
Mhm.
chained up, being taken care of. And so you find, I think, myself included at that age, you find ways to impact the world and how you can. And often how
Mhm.
you can is two fingers up, one on
Yeah.
each hand, I think
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
her attitude right now because she doesn't have anyone to trust or care about. Why should she?
Yeah.
So it worked for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. It's just the as you said earlier, the rest of the show is so dark
Yeah.
that to have this one character kind of coming in and cracking one, it's like it felt a little weird to me. But maybe I'll get more used to it as the show goes on. So,
Well, I think they tried one line to explain that. I think it's a test line of, oh gosh, what does she say? These pre-outbreak kids, like they
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know. It's like Ellie, yeah, it was 20 years, right? So she doesn't know a thing. This is
Well,
what she's raised.
I think what she was saying is like children that were born after the outbreak have only known lawlessness. That's kind of
Yeah,
my sense is like, um, and there's a scene early on where like uh the radio guy is like, "Hey, there's like other stuff out there that's not just like cordyceps. There's like really dark human stuff, like people taking slaves and you know Mad Max Fury Road style stuff going on out there."
yeah. You think the QZ's bad, baby?
Yeah,
You ain't seen nothing yet.
exactly. That's what awaits you. So, anyway, it's a fair point, Christian, that it's like maybe accurate, but tonally just felt a little weird to me. Who knows? Maybe I'll get more used to it as the show goes on. Um, okay, so they try to escape from the city, but then they get caught by the same guard that Joel was selling pills to earlier. Whoa, coincidence. So he starts
Casting
scanning.
budget is all that was. They didn't have
Mm,
they used their money dropping 3 real planes from the sky, so they had to, "Who are we
mhm,
gonna,
mhm.
oh,
Yeah,
Ted, you're available again, get."
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the guard says he wants to do this by the books. Like he's not happy that Joel's there because he thinks that
He
Joel
warned
has
him.
put him in a bad position where he's like, oh, okay, I'm either gonna have to report this, which means you're gonna hang, or you're gonna have to give me a bribe so big that I'm gonna have to, to make me forget about this. So he's like, I'm gonna do this by the book. So he starts scanning them, and before he can scan Ellie, Ellie stabs him right, like right when he's about to scan her. And Ellie starts saying like, "Hey, like I'm not infected. Like I've gotten bitten, but I'm not infected." And Tess sees that the machine has shown red, and chaos ensues. Joel has a flashback to when another uh, military slash law enforcement officer was pointing a gun at him and somebody that he was entrusted to care about, and he just goes wild on this guard and beats him to death with his bare hands. Brutal scene. Lots going on, like lots of stuff happening. You're finding out stuff about Ellie. You're finding about like the relationship between them, and then obviously Joel killing this guy who he was quasi friends with slash acquaintances with. What did you think of this as the conclusion for the episode, Christian? As I mean, the conclusion is they kind of walk away into the distance as you see like towers in Boston in disarray. Um, but yeah, this is like kind of the climax, the emotional climax of this part of the episode. What'd you think of it?
It packs a punch. You learn a whole bunch, right? Like you mentioned that drop of Ellie, um, and so much of the storytelling that had happened before paying off now. The red light on the child. Now we have another red light on a child. The poster showing how fast you would become infected from a bite on the arm. You see that Ellie has this bite on her arm, and it's old, and so like something is off, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
everything this show has told you means that she should be one of these things by now, and she's not. So that's super interesting and immediately raises the stakes for who she is. And then seeing Joel have that PTSD moment of, like a Sarah flashback. And throughout the show too, we see his watch over and over and over again as this touch point for him. Like it's broken, but he has it when they leave the QZ. He takes of the things he takes on this journey, one of them is a broken watch that we last saw his daughter giving to him fixed, like prior in this story.
Mhm.
And so like that connection is there for this character. And then to see him, brutally attack and, as you mentioned, likely kill this Fedra agent, as we just came out of a scene with Joel and Marlene agreeing to work together because their interests align. And now we see Joel do something so violent to someone whose interests also used to align with his.
Mhm.
It's like, keep your friends close, enemies closer. Like, who is Joel and how trustworthy? Did Marlene make a terrible mistake here? Because,
Yeah.
if push comes to shove, Joel's a loose cannon, and here they go, just the three of them off into this big bad world. And I think everybody's on eggshells a little bit. It's a shocking end, I think, to this episode setting up who these characters might be. I don't
Yeah.
know if I leave thinking Joel's a good guy. like I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's like she kind of Marlene alludes earlier to the fact that she's like, I know what you guys are capable of, and it's like, what is she talking about there? What is Joel capable of? Because we saw Joel beat Miss Connie's mom down with a wrench earlier in the episode, so it's like, what has Joel done in the last 20 years? To survive, basically, is an open question.
And I think there's a
Um,
veteran sticker on the back of the truck
yeah,
in the
yes,
pre-outbreak also. So it's, that this guy knows how to handle the weapons, like that shortcut of like, this is why they're trained. It's not me. Someone giving me a rifle and me immediately shooting myself in the foot. Uh, Joel knows what he's doing.
Any other thoughts on this episode? I thought it was a very strong pilot episode. I liked it. I'm interested to see what happens next. Uh, I purposefully have not watched the next episode because I'm waiting to record this, but I'm probably right afterwards. I'm going to go watch it because uh, I'm liking the world that it's creating. I'm liking this journey that these characters are having. I'm liking the cast so far. Overall, I'm enjoying the show. Any other thoughts, Christian?
No, I agree. Likewise, the only thought would be, again, it reinforces anyone can die. That Fedra agent dies. Robert dies. Robert seems like this major underworld gangster. And not only does Robert die, he dies unceremoniously off screen.
Yeah, yeah,
And Marlene sees him and is like, idiot. And so, here we go into the world, but a very effective pilot. And I'm super curious what folks that don't have familiarity with the franchise, how they've reacted to it. But I think the curse of the video game adaptation or whatever, which I think has already largely been broken. But no part about this screamed, oh, video game show. This felt like prestige TV through and through. And, for better or worse, the show has expectations of its own to live up to now.
yeah, 100%. In the bonus episode that we'll release this week, and also for specifically for decodingtv.com members, I want to talk with you about some of the changes that the show has made compared to the video game. But I'm just going to mention one, and I don't believe this is I'm fairly confident this is not any spoiler at all. But one of the changes is in the video game. So this is just a preview of that talk. So in the video game, there Joel is not dealing drugs to some Fedra guard, as far as I can recall. And so then the encounter where he beats the guard to death at the end of this episode happens pretty similarly to how it happens in the show. But in the show, in the video game, it's a completely random guard person. You've never met that person before. And I really like that as a change because it's oh, this is a guy that Joel knew. Joel beat to death a guy he knew. It wasn't just he beat to death a random faceless stranger. He beat to death someone he had actually what seems to be a many months, if not years long relationship with. And so it really does do a good job of an even better job than the game of landing what Joel is capable of doing at this stage.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
So one of many changes that we'll discuss in the next episode, the bonus episode, but I just appreciated that narratively. So anyway, that's going to bring us into this week's episode of Decoding TV. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we want to hear what you thought about the pilot of The Last of Us. Be sure to email us at decodingtv@gmail.com. You can also find us on YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram at decodingtv. Christian Spicer, where can people find more of your work on the internet this week?
Easiest place is over at my website, christianspicer.com. There's a microblog there, as well as a link to my newsletter, which you can also find directly at tinyletter.com/Christian Spicer, where I mostly write long form about video games. Speaking of which, I host a video game podcast with Mr. Jeff Kanata each week called DLC, where we talk about the games we're playing, the big news in the space, and we do it in a friendly and positive way, in a way that is clean. So you can listen to it with your kids in the car or in the building as well. So check that out if you haven't yet.
All right. And speaking of newsletters, I also have one at decodingeverything.com. Check that one out as well. It's free. All right. Until next week, we'll see you later for another episode of Decoding TV recapping The Last of Us. Goodbye. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.